This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network. Well, greetings, Claire, and welcome to another episode of Healing Ties 2.0, featured on the Whole Care Network and UK Health Radio. It's great to visit with you today.
You too. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
I know a little bit about you, but our listeners would be interested in knowing, how are you creating Healing Ties?
About 5 years ago, I started a patient advocacy blog called the Patient Advocates Chronicle that helps patients, people like me, hopefully feel less isolated and, maybe give them a boost into becoming their own advocates, because I feel like that's a piece that's greatly missing. And just recently, I am launching a consultancy born of the blog called TPAC Consulting, where I'm trying to bring the patient perspective to all the decision makers who want to help patients.
A patient advocate, that leads me to believe that you've had some experience as being a patient.
Yes, a lot. Nearly 40 years, which I will confess is almost my whole lifetime.
Talk a little bit about that if you feel comfortable.
Sure. It started out with an acute episode. It was B-strep spinal meningitis that killed all the other kids that had it in my town and left me in a wheelchair for a year and a half and with brain damage that has since recovered. I had a few minor chronics back then, so light asthma, a few allergies, but 8 years after I recovered from the meningitis, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I was so filled with rage at the time that I went into 6 years of non-compliance and basically gave myself half a dozen conditions and developed another half a dozen. So my laundry list right now sits at about 13, most of them nuisance, but they still need to be, addressed and made sure that all the conditions are happy.
So 18 months in a wheelchair, how old were you in that time in your life?
They let me out of the hospital for my 6th birthday. So it was between 6 and 8. It was a very formative time, and I believe, having gone over it in a lot of therapy, that time has had a lasting impact. Things like, I don't like being the center of attention, because when you are, a little kid in a wheelchair, especially in the early 80s, nobody knew how to deal with that. They didn't know how to treat you. They always stared. It was just not as forward-thinking as it is today. And when I was recovering, my mom would have to hold me up by my belt loops, or I would push an empty wheelchair, and that did not lessen the unwelcome attention that I would get.
Goodness, I can't even imagine what something like this would be like. And then for you to come full circle in recovery and become a patient advocate, you can see things from the perspective from your own care that many of us can't. I'd really love to hear about how you use your experience to help other patients.
Sure. As I said, one of the goals of the blog is to help patients not feel so isolated. And when I launched it, I could have launched another diabetes blog, but there are so many fantastic ones out there. What I was really wanted to do was emphasize the things that we have in common. I'm not sure that patients are aware, but when it comes to chronic and autoimmune diseases, the Ford Foundation put out an article years ago that basically said that half of Americans have at least one. 160 million people in this country have at least one chronic or autoimmune disease. But I would guess that every single one of those 160 million Americans has felt isolated and alone in what they're struggling with at least once or twice in the course of their diseases. And that doesn't help. It makes us not want to keep up our regimens. It makes us depressed. And I don't think that we have to be there. We can understand what our commonalities are, then you don't have to have the exact same disease or condition that somebody else has in order to provide support.
And I think we've talked about this before. I'm a big proponent of story sharing because I believe it's, when we share our stories and our experiences, not only do we have a better understanding of each person, but we recognize that, we're not that much different. Yet it's through the story sharing where resources and commonality is found and comfort. And I can imagine, I'm kind of projecting here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but as formative years growing up, you being in a wheelchair, I would imagine you could really get in touch when you see someone at that age in a wheelchair and how you might be able to help them and their parents.
Yes, I definitely have empathy at the struggles of getting along. I remember being carried by various adults in my family straight-legged because the Americans with Disabilities Act didn't exist back then. So there weren't a lot of ramps to get into buildings or restaurants or things like that. In a way, it's gotten easier policy-wise and access-wise, but in a way, we still have a lot of road to cover before there is actually equal access for people with physical disabilities. And I think that people can imagine, as you said, what it's like, but there are so many other things attached to it. And I'm a big proponent of understanding how mental health is affected by physical health and vice versa. And I think that, honestly, without the near continuous therapy that I've had since I was 16, I wouldn't understand all of these sort of ripples and resonating things. And that was a gift also that my therapists along the way have given me, to really understand that if I'm feeling this way, if I'm acting self-destructive, take a look at what's happening in the larger picture or in the past that I haven't dealt with. And these things don't just go away. And you have to get to a point where you recognize them and can treat yourself nicely when things aren't going so well.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you just said there, because there's two words that really resonated: self-destructive.
That's me. I'm an expert on self-destructive.
Because let's just talk real openly here. When we're feeling bad or things aren't going the way that we would like them to go, sometimes our mind and our wonderment takes over, which has an impact on our recovery. But to recognize this and be able to talk openly really helps you get beyond that. So I'd really love to hear how you've gotten beyond that.
It took a long, long time. And it really starts when I was diagnosed with diabetes. And as I said, the enormous amount of rage that I felt. Because once you get through something like meningitis and recovering to the point that no one would know you'd ever been in a wheelchair, you feel like your medical dues have been paid. And diabetes is one of those things that is all encompassing. Like you're never off. You can never be off. And so when I started realizing what this took, and to be perfectly honest, the care that was available in my hometown was subpar. They didn't understand what pediatric endocrinologists needed to do. There weren't any. I was going to a pediatrician who just happened to treat all the type 1 diabetics in town. And through his poor practices, and when I say that, I was 14, and he used to have me leave the room while he discussed my treatment with my parents. Um, and things like initially I was 90 pounds and at a very sensitive age for a teenager, whether you're a girl or a boy. And
Right.
in 6 months, they'd put me on a diet. They wouldn't take me off. I gained 60 pounds in 6 months and automatically associated insulin with weight gain. So basically, between my rage and their
Ah.
treatment, they treated me right into an eating disorder for 6 years, which I, I was told later on, basically what I was doing was putting a turkey down, like a whole turkey down the garbage disposal that was my kidneys. And so when I say I gave myself several sort of diabetes side effects, primarily kidney disease, mid-stage kidney disease by the time I was 29. I'm not kidding. And that was a wake-up call. That diagnosis was the first time I ever actively feared for my life and thought to myself, what have I done?
Hmm.
Um, and so when it comes to the self-destructive part, I'm sure people have thought this in their heads. You have this extra thing that you have to do where you don't feel like anybody else has to do that, and you think, well, if this is going to end up in this direction, then what's the point anyway? I'm going to go out and do what I want to do, whether it's good for me or bad for me. And sorry to use this language on the podcast, but to hell with the consequences. I'll deal with it when it happens. But I am here to tell you that self-destructive behavior in a medical circumstance does have consequences, that bit of rebellion, it's just not worth it.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, because that self-destructive behavior, that rebellion, I think it's all in us.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, um, and for a variety of reasons, whether it's societal or where you're living or just the condition that you're dealing with.
Right.
I I think we all have the, I don't know if ability is the right word to use here, but you know, we can, every one of us can rebel about our care,
Yes.
uh,
Absolutely.
and want to kind of like just give up. But you fought through that. So what was the
Yeah.
what was the what was the key that unlocked the door for you?
Fear. When I
Fear.
was 20, I first started developing serious complications. And
Hmm.
that is the first two I developed were retinopathy, which was interfering with my ability to see because I
Hmm.
had leakage in the of liquid leakage in my eyes,
Hmm.
and also peripheral neuropathy, which is commonly referred to as diabetic nerve pain in my legs. And after having recovered from being paralyzed and having another hit to my mobility, I thought to myself, no, we are not going down this path again. We've already dealt with, you know, losing mobility and independence. And if this is in my control, which it was,
Right.
we're not, I'm just not doing this again. And so
Hmm.
that was my wake up call, my straighten up and fly right, or else more of this is going to happen realization. But it did take hitting, I will call it near rock bottom, because certainly I could have sort of proceeded in a negative way, um, to really get my attention as an overly medically educated teenager while I was 20, but and say, you have to decide. This is within your control. You're a college student now. Nobody is
Hmm.
going to tell you, but this is your decision. And it's not the first time I've had to make that kind of decision, but I'm glad I went in that direction. It wasn't
Right.
assured.
Because you could have easily have taken the other route and just say, like you said, the hell with all this.
Yeah. But it's interesting because, to be perfectly honest, one of the things that fuels that is that even though I've been pretty close a few times, I am terrified of death. Thinking about my own death gives me panic attacks. So I really
Hmm.
try not to think about it when I'm in the car.
Yeah,
So,
that's a that's a good thing.
right, exactly. So, I like I said, in the meningitis, I was in a coma for 3 days.
Yeah.
Um, the other kids who had it that year in my town died, and I knew that. And so in a 6-year-old or very immature way, I understood my mortality very early in life.
Hmm.
And as I developed these really dramatic and painful complications of diabetes, it was fear of death that really drove me to find a path.
Well, and I think what's interesting about this, Claire, is that, and it comes up often in caregiving. We have choices.
Right.
You've hit on a number of real important topics, isolation, for being one of them. That we can choose our direction. But that whole mind over matter thing can get real complicated when you're in the middle of dealing with a serious illness.
Absolutely. Yes, it can. And it's a lot of it depends on what kind of support you have around you.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's from a caregiver, whether it's from your provider team, hopefully people have a team if they need one. Um, but all of that affects it, especially if you're young or you're new to this game. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, yes, it is a game in my head. You move one chess piece, it affects all the other chess
Oh,
pieces.
very much so. It is it kind of like a game of chance.
Exactly. And I will say, even with all of this, I was very lucky, um, in that one parent was a health insurance executive. So as I was growing up, he could teach me how to look at health insurance from the inside out. And the other parent had a very serious chronic illness of her own. So she could teach me how to be a chronic patient. And her philosophy, and she'd gone undiagnosed with Crohn's disease from the age of 12 to the age of, I want to say, about 27. And she taught me that if you want a life, go out and live your life, and if you have to accommodate, then you accommodate. And that's a whole different um, sort of challenge for chronic pain patients. I've very briefly dealt with chronic pain. Mine ended when the peripheral neuropathy got under control. But I can say that with mine, but I do have to leave that caveat out there for chronic pain patients, that it's a different ballgame.
And kind of shift gears here for a second. So when you got that pain under control, how did how did that happen? Was that a decision that you made to change uh, something in your life that?
Yeah, that was all wrapped up with that 20-year-old first development of complications, and I just turned out very lucky because my body is a weirdo. It doesn't do things the way other people's bodies do, and for the
Mhm.
most part, my body has compensated. Every once in a while, I will get a cluster of nerves firing off every few seconds in my left big toe, but otherwise, the neuropathy itself is under really good control. But yeah, it was that same sort of fear episode that drove me to get treatment, to figure out what the right medication was. And that was an interesting episode in itself, where at first I was taking a medication that ended up giving me grand mal seizures. So we had to we had to move away from that one and find something a little bit more appropriate for how my body worked. And that's a weird story too, in that that reaction for that drug was 0.3 of 1% of people. Almost no physician would think, oh, she's having this is happening because of this medication. It took
Right.
a psychiatrist to help me figure it out. So
Well, that's kind of the marvels of medicine because
yeah,
and you said it very clearly about your body is unique
yeah,
to all of our bodies are unique, and while there's physicians can read the data and see how different meds mix with others, you really don't know until you take it yourself.
exactly. And that's actually one of the ideas I'm trying to communicate in both the blog and my new consultancy, is that um, patients have their own level of expertise. And there
Right.
is a very large qualitative component to medical treatment, especially for chronically ill patients. And yes, our providers are experts in, the dynamics of the disease, but we as patients need to bring that experience that of our own bodies that we've gained in the 3 or 4 or 6 months between appointments into that office, because without that understanding of what is going on in an individual patient's life, even things that cause stress versus things that are directly related to the disease, a provider isn't going to be able to effectively treat the person unless they know more about how the individual body is reacting to the treatment that they'd already decided on.
Right, and that then it comes back full circle to about being a patient advocate or a caregiver advocate.
Right.
Having more than one set of eyes on an issue.
Yeah.
I always like to tell when I'm consulting with folks about on caregiving, uh, are you're not going into the doctor's office with your care partner? You're trusting the care partner to tell the doctor exactly what's going on. Because when you're impacted yourself, you're emotional, and sometimes you don't hear what the doctor is saying, and then a lot of times you're not telling the doctor what's actually happening.
Right. And how many of us have left a doctor's appointment thinking, darn it, I forgot to mention that one thing that's been on my mind all week. So it's important to have, if you have someone who goes with you who is a care partner, it is important to involve them in your appointments. I used to do that for my mother when she went into her appointments, and it was just, you're right, it was just an extra check. It was so that she didn't forget. Unfortunately, I don't have a care partner right now, but
Mm-hmm.
I am fortunate enough to have really good communications with the doctors I see most.
And I would imagine another important uh, person for you, and well, if really for anybody on a care team, would be a pharmacist.
Oh, yes. And it's difficult because I get most of my medications through a mail order pharmacy, and things have changed in the customer service realm. So if something goes wrong, you don't get your medication. You end up going to, how many phone calls to try to
Mm-hmm.
get it worked out. And you may or may not have the time and energy to do that. But there is one pharmacist that I see for things that I can't wait the 3 months for if they don't get delivered.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, there was one missing prescription, and the pharmacist just could not get around the block because I wasn't supposed to reorder it for another few weeks. And I said, okay, so what if we don't put it through insurance? How much has it been? And it turned out it was $24 to get the drug, a month's supply of the drug without insurance. So to have a pharmacist that will work with you on things like that is a gift. When I was in college, there was a guy who would give me extra insulin if I waited too long to renew the prescription just until the prescription came in.
Right.
I've always been that kind of patient, for better or worse.
Well, and you're using that skills as a patient to help others, which is very important.
Yeah, I hope so.
You had told me, I think, and if I got this wrong, please correct me, but you had a conversation with medical students about your experience. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that was like?
Yeah, so to back up a little bit, when I started my career, I wanted nothing to do with healthcare. I mean, I
Mm.
live it, I breathe it, I sleep it 24/7. And so it was really on the bottom of my list. But one former clinician that I'm still pretty close to invited me to be a patient interview at Georgetown Medical School about 6 years ago. And that setup is he gives his lecture for about an hour on diabetes as a metabolic disease, and then
Mm.
they invite a patient to come in, and I said, of course I'll help. I'm always willing to help on whatever. But as it got closer, I realized that this wasn't a shrug your shoulders, lark kind of thing. It was actually a pretty decent responsibility because I would be their first exposure as a patient
Hmm.
to a patient, and so I decided that in order to help them become the kind of provider that I would see, and I admit I am very picky, that it needed to be a no holds barred conversation, no question off limits. And so that's what we did. Um, I was incredibly nervous, and the first one became sort of a data dump. But I'll
Mm-hmm.
do credit to that first class. One kid did ask me how I thought I would die. Um, so I encourage them, and I've done it 7 times now, to ask questions that will make me uncomfortable. If that's what they need to know, that's what they need to know, because they're going to encounter situations where they're going to have to answer uncomfortable questions and maybe hear answers that they don't want to hear or don't expect. But that person is still their patient, and they still need to
Right.
have a conversation and, develop and reach mutual goals so that the patient is involved in their own care to the point where they're living the life that they want. And goals between patients and
Yeah.
providers can be different.
As can goals between care partners and caregivers can be
Absolutely.
different.
Yep.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, goodness. What a delightful conversation. And I know you've had an experience as being a caregiver as well. And how does that play into your role as an advocate?
uh, it it's a large part of what drives me. Uh, Most of my caregiving experience is with my mother. There's a little bit with her father, who had dementia at the end of his life. But, and I want to make it very clear that my dad was present, but my mother was my primary caregiver as a child.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I was paralyzed, she told me later, that if we went 3 years with no progress, she would give up. But until that day, 3 years from when I got out of the hospital, she was going to push me and push me and push me. And she did, until I hated her. Because how many times can you throw the stupid beanbag through the stupid tire every day?
Right.
But that involved physical therapy every day for 6 months, occupational therapy on top of it several times a week. It involved putting an old time wheelchair, so heavy, not easily
Oh,
maneuverable, into the back of a
yeah.
Pontiac. She chipped her tooth at one point getting it out. Um, my grandparents would come to us. They were from the Washington D.C. area, and I was in Indiana. But it also involved us going there. So driving with a disabled child and a woman with Crohn's disease, who, by definition, kind of had to know where every clean bathroom between Indiana and Washington, D.C. was. So without her, I'm not sure I would be here. I certainly wouldn't be walking.
And that experience, I just love the way you said that at the end. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here walking.
Right. I have zero doubt. And then when the diabetes came along, that was much more complicated because she knew exactly what I was doing. I can remember her yelling at me, "Why are you killing yourself?" And that's not how I viewed it, because, everybody has a right to be young and stupid. I was just young and stupid in a really harmful way. Um, they even in the first 2 years, 14 years old to 16 years old, where I was out of control and not following a regimen.
Mm-hmm.
They even tried to put me into a closed unit psychiatric ward for 2 weeks over my Christmas holiday. And I told them not to do it, that it wouldn't work, because even back then I was very good at telling people what they wanted to hear. They still did
Mm-hmm.
it. It was a waste of about $10,000 in what was already a very expensive disease. So they did it. It came out, nothing happened, and this is going to sound weird, but one of the best things she did to me, not to me, for me, was to say, okay, we can't anymore. She has to come to this herself. And it's going to be really painful to just sit back and watch her do what she's going to do. But at this point, there's nothing else we can do. She has to do it herself. And yes, there was a lot of extra damage that I did to myself, but she was right. Generally speaking, you can't help people who don't want to be helped. They have to come to it. You can't force a square peg into a round hole. And I
Right.
have a sneaking suspicion that I know that I made my parents cry. And if you are an adult, and hopefully that's never happened in your life, but if you're a kid and you've done it and you reach adulthood, it breaks your heart, and that never changes. But
Yeah, oh goodness, because I think we can all look back as being a kid and doing things that as a kid would do, and then you look back as an adult, say, yeah, maybe I could have made a different decision there. But that's just part of growing up.
yeah, and when you're in it, you don't realize it. The
You don't
hindsight is
realize it.
2020 thing is
Yeah.
100% accurate. But again, without her backing off and letting me come to it on myself, I don't know if I would. And she was the one who went with me when from diagnosis of retinopathy to my first laser surgery was 6 days. They sent me to the Joslin Clinic because our ophthalmologist had connections there. And as I said, from diagnosis to surgery was 6 days. I needed her there. I needed that security blanket while I was very quickly coming into control in a way that I'd never had before. And I was surrounded by providers I didn't know. And it was outpatient, and we were in a hotel in Boston together, and I was really scared. And so there was no question. She came up there and, helped me go through the whole thing. And that experience between her being there and me finding my first provider who actually treated me like I had a brain in my head was also a transformative experience. So.
Oh goodness, what a delightful, what a delightful conversation. I think this is a perfect time to take our break. And when we come back, I want to follow up on that about that physician who had paid special attention to you. But just as important, as we do with all our guests, we're going to ask you about one fun fact about you that everybody would want to know that you're going to reveal right here on Healing Ties. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, you're listening to Healing Ties 2.0, featured on the Whole Care Network and on UK Health Radio, the world's #1 talk health radio. We'll be right back. Hey, it's Christopher McClellan. You know me as the Bowtie Guy. On Healing Ties 2.0, we visit with people from all over the globe who share their stories because it's through story sharing where diversity meets the road to collaborate on a common cause. And if you would like to share your story on Healing Ties, email me direct at thebowtieguy@healingties.com. We would love to share your story to your health, happiness, and prosperity. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're continuing our delightful conversation with patient advocate Claire Sachs. So, Claire, I forewarned you before the break. This is that time where we kind of put all of our guests on the spot, and we want to know that one fun fact about you that everybody's just sitting on the edge of their seats wanting to know. So, the microphone is all yours.
Thank you. I was trying to think of something that I haven't put out in my blog. And I think the one I landed on is I still watch cartoons every day. In a lot of ways, I still feel that I never grew up. And in a good way. And in some ways, I hope I never lose that right. Childlike enjoyment of things. And so watching cartoons helps me keep that lightness that kids have sometimes, instead of all this other heavy stuff that we deal with every day. So yes, I'm a big fan of cartoons.
You're a big fan. So I have to have a follow-up question or two. What's your favorite cartoon?
Oh goodness, there are a lot. I do like the Disney Channel ones. I think one of my favorites right now is the How to Train Your Dragon series. They have a cartoon show that goes between a couple of the movies. I forget which ones, but it's just fun. And the dragons are like puppies, so
I remember, oh goodness, you're taking me back to my childhood days because on Saturdays, at least here in the United States. I'd be interested to hear from our UK listeners on Saturday morning. I think it's still, well, TV is so much different now. Every Saturday morning was right in front of the TV, watching the cartoons, and then right after the cartoons, I'd go to Saturday morning bowling, and that was my day for Saturday. So, but my favorite cartoon would have been the Flintstones.
Oh yeah, Flintstones was great.
Flintstones is great, and I'm sure if I think of a few more, I'll come up. But that's
Yeah,
great.
exactly.
We've had a lot of wonderful revelations. The cartoons is the first. That's the first time we've had this season on Healing Time. So I appreciate you sharing that. But
Yeah, there's a child in my life who had a fight with her parents once, and I went up to talk to her about it, and she says, how come you understand me so much better than my parents do?" And I said, "Oh, honey, I don't have kids. I never grew up."
I could use that one too. And I think
Yeah.
come to think about it, because I don't have kids either, but I've got 25 nieces and nephews and 40 great nieces and nephews, and I think there's some great nieces and nephews on the way this year. But who can keep
That
track
is
of all that?
awesome. Yeah,
But
nothing for me. There are very few things that heal more than spending time with a little kid. But that is a whole other.
that's a whole, and let's just kind of take that full circle here because of what you went through as a little kid.
Yeah, my childhood pretty much ended with meningitis.
Uh,
I not only did I know my mortality, after that, nobody treated me like a kid anymore. I was always a little adult. And I fostered that. I wanted that. I wanted to be involved in grown up conversations and have people ask my opinion of things. Um, so, yeah, I think that perhaps some of the things that I do now are making up for that lost childhood.
and by being a patient advocate, especially, and I'm kind of projecting here again, but being an advocate for a family with a sick child
Hmm.
would have to be very special for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote a post years ago about back then it was some of the children's hospitals, some of the famous ones, especially in the holiday season where um, they're all asking for donations because they do such great work, and anything that we can give to them is put to good use.
Hmm.
But I had an issue with how they were doing it. They were putting these kids on pedestals. No child belongs on a pedestal. No person belongs on a pedestal. And when you put a child that young up as a hero for dealing with something that they have no choice about, it does affect the psychology of the child for the rest of the child's life.
Hmm.
And so, um, good, bad, or indifferent, there needs to be a consciousness there about the psychology of the child, and
Right.
not just what it takes to deal with the disease, but how everybody else is reacting to the disease. Because, like I said, you understand your mortality, but not in the way grown-ups understand their mortality. Children are not small grown-ups. And so there has to be a language around it. There has to be body language around it that makes the child as comfortable as the child can be, but doesn't hide things or lie about things, or,
Right.
there's an appropriateness that didn't exist when I was a child patient. Um,
That old phrase that people say, "Oh, everything is going to be all right." Well, in a lot of cases, that's not true,
and the child knows it.
and the child knows it.
Yep.
Just be honest.
Yep. Children and pets, they know when you're lying to them.
They the children. That's for sure. I
Right.
don't have a pet either, but I do like chia pets. They don't take a
Right.
whole lot of care. But before we went to the break, you had said something. You've said many profound things here, but before we went to the break, you were talking about one of the physicians that had an impact on you, and I'd really love for you to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Sure. It was a revelation to me, and I think it was just him in his regular workday. I was sitting in his um, not office, but one of the treatment rooms right before I went in to have laser surgery, which I didn't know what that meant. It was very scary. And he was writing, as most providers do. They write notes while you're there. And he said, "Give me a minute, let me finish writing, and then I'll tell you what I wrote." Nobody had ever offered to share what their notes were with me. And I thought, oh, so I get to know about this too. And that, he never realized it, and I had the opportunity to go back to the Jocelyn Clinic, and he was still practicing 20 years later. And I made a point of stopping there just for a minute and saying, you probably don't realize what you did that day, but this is what you did. And so that laid the groundwork for what I would come to expect from my treating providers, which is to be treated as a peer, as a contributor to my own care. Mm-hmm. And then shortly after that, when I graduated from college and had to find doctors in my new hometown, which was Washington, D.C., which has a lot of fantastic medical institutions, I made the right choice by accident. I saw someone on the local news who had inhaler insulin, which was the latest thing back then. And I thought, okay, he's got the latest technology. If he's still seeing patients, I want to be one. And I was. And I walked into that office on a defensive posture, completely defensive posture. Shortly after the greetings, I said, I'm going to be a terrible patient. I'm going to self-medicate. I'm not going to listen to you, but I still need someone to run the circus. And he shrugged his shoulders and said, okay, you can't engage with someone who doesn't pick up the weapon. So,
right.
So, and this is the doctor who invited me to be the speaker at his guest lecture. So, in a way, he kind of started everything on a couple of different levels, both being my doctor and teaching me how to be a good patient by non-judgment. Things like I would cancel appointments if my labs weren't where I wanted them to be, and he'd say, kind of roll his eyes at me and say, no, that's when you come in because we need to fix what's wrong. I mean, if everything's going right, there is no real discussion. So come in when something is wrong and we will fix it.
He taught you the importance of self-care.
Yeah, he did. And he is also a go-to person when I want to know if technology is just more bells and whistles or if there's a significant upgrade. He went to go do research for a few years and then came back because he hated it. But when he left, I said, you know me, find me you. And he did. So in my second endocrinologist, I've been very lucky. And basically my entire care team, which is about a dozen providers of various stripes, all stem from that first interaction.
It's so important to have those advocates as you are becoming one yourself, to help people along their care journey. Claire, I can't thank you enough for visiting with me today. I want to do more of these with you. Yeah. But before we go, let all of our listeners know how they can read your blog, find out information about your advocacy work. This is your time to shine again.
Thank you. My blog is called The Patient Advocates Chronicle, and it's at www.patientadvocateschronicle.com. On Twitter, I'm at The Advocate is In. And just to plug my new business, the consultancy is TPAC Consulting at www.tpacconsulting.com.
Well, Claire, with all the great work that you're doing and the advocacy and sharing your story, you're certainly someone who's creating healing ties all around us. I can't thank you enough for joining me today.
And thank you so much for having me.